The two top offensive linemen in the NFL draft are neck and neck, and NFL teams disagree on whether Will Campbell from LSU is better than Armand Membou from Missouri or vice versa. But I think the most important question for us is which one would be a better fit for the Chicago Bears with the 10th overall pick.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, I want to do a deep dive on each of the two offensive tackle prospects in this draft class, Will Campbell from LSU and Armand Membou from Missouri. We'll look at the pros and cons of each of them and which one then would be a better fit for the Chicago Bears, because this is a process Chicago's going through right now. Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson building their draft board and looking at all the different possibilities, because we've seen mock drafts where both Will Campbell and Armand Membou are available when the Bears are on the clock with the 10th overall pick, and then you've got to decide. Of course, there are also situations where maybe Campbell is gone, but Membou could be there, or Membou could be gone and Campbell could be there, or both of them could be taken before the Bears pick with the 10th overall pick, but we have to be ready for any and all possibilities, and trying to separate these two is a tricky process because they're two very different styles of players. So I want to focus in on each of them individually and then sort of put them side by side. Let's start with Will Campbell from LSU, because I think he's kind of the more commonly connected to the Bears mock draft pick for Chicago. I think when you look at consensus mock drafts and big boards and stuff, Chicago is one of the common places where Will Campbell goes, even more so than Armand Membou. And I think for Campbell, the negatives is kind of the big obvious one. We've talked a lot about arm length for him this offseason, and there was a lot of confusion and controversy because evidently whoever was measuring arm length at the NFL Combine was messing up quite a bit. Now, typically every year, every team and all the draft analysts, they use the Combine measurements are the official measurements. But this year, for the first time, the Combine measurements seem to be off because everybody's 40 out of the 45 offensive linemen or whatever it was had different arm lengths at their pro days and at the Senior Bowl than they had at the Combine. And so we're now sort of saying, hey, Combine measurements, at least at arm length, to be specific, were not correct. And so you have to go with pro day arm length. And that gave Will Campbell an extra couple eighths of an inch of arm length that got him to have 33-inch arms instead of, I think it was 32 5/8. So all of a sudden, is he a better football player because his arms are 3/8 of an inch longer than we thought they would be? No. But I do think even at 33, there are still length concerns about Will Campbell, because it's not just arm length, but it's also wingspan. And that's where this becomes tricky, because even now at 33-inch arms, there are a number of offensive tackles in the NFL with shorter arms than Will Campbell. But you're hard-pressed to find offensive tackles in the NFL with shorter wingspans than Will Campbell. You look at the shortest arm offensive line starter at offensive tackle is Braden Smith, I believe of the Indianapolis Colts, who has 32.25-inch arms, shortest arm length of tackle in the NFL. But even he has a wingspan just over 78 inches. Will Campbell's down at 77. And a lot of these other short arm tackles like Luke Gadecki or Kendall Lamb, Caleb McGarry of the Falcons, Bernard Ryman of the Colts, these guys have 79, 80-inch wingspans. Campbell's is down at just over 77. We're talking 2 to 3 inches shorter on the wingspan than some of the other shortest length offensive tackles. So it's not just, arm length is just shoulder down to the end of the fingertip, but wingspan is obviously fingertip to fingertip. And so when you're talking about being able to keep a pass rusher in front of you, if he goes from your left side to your right side, right? It's not just the length of your arm, like from your torso to your fingertip, but it's how, in a lot of ways, how wide you can spread out and both with your feet and your arms stay in front of someone and not let them get too far outside of your body to be able to then, turn the corner and get upfield around you, whether that's working to the inside or the outside. And that's where one of the main primary concerns for Will Campbell is. We heard on yesterday's podcast, Ben Johnson talked about how when it comes to arm length and offensive tackles, that it's really about, or 2 days ago on the podcast, it's less about the measurement and it's more about whether that shows up on tape or not. And if it shows up consistently on tape, then you might be concerned about it. If it doesn't show up on tape because he can make up for it with proper technique, then that's not as big of a concern. And certainly the big strengths for Will Campbell is, that technique, his form, his hands, his base, his feet. There is a precision to how he plays the offensive line and the offensive tackle position. Everything tends to be exactly where it needs to be. There's not a lot of sloppiness. Think of this guy coming to the NFL and it's like, oh, we really got to clean up X, Y, or Z before he can become the type of offensive lineman we believe he can be. Like, he's kind of already there. Not that he's perfect by any means, but he's way ahead of where a lot of young offensive linemen and offensive tackles come into the NFL. This is why there's so much confidence in the idea of, well, you can just move him inside the guard because you're not going to have to teach him hand placement and footwork and stuff because he's already doing that at such a high level that if he doesn't work at tackle, you think that'll all translate more easily to the inside there. And I certainly agree that with that as a premise, I do see some concern with how high he is in his stance. He has a very vertical stance, and when he gets back in pass protection, he has a very high pad level there. And I wonder how that feels to me like something that will have to change when he moves inside the guard. You have to change his stance, which is a pretty fundamental day one basic offensive line thing that kind of sets the tone for everything else. So I do have some doubts there, but he does feel to me like a guy who's like plug and play. You're not worried about those kind of like rookie moments where it's like, oh man, this really savvy pass rusher was just a step smarter than him and pulled a move on him that he wasn't ready for, just had better technique that Campbell couldn't take up with. Like, he comes in the NFL and he plays like a seasoned pro, a seasoned veteran, almost from day one. Like, that's the type of refined product of an offensive lineman that you get in Campbell. And that's really, really enticing as a top 10 pick, right? If you could just get a guy who right away, you hardly have to do a lot of work on him. He's just ready to go. Left tackle, played left tackle at a really high level at the college level for multiple seasons. This is a guy, there's no, as long as you're not concerned about the arm length, he's ready to go. And that's just the big caveat that lingers over him. That if his wingspan were 3 inches longer and his arms were another inch longer, I don't know that there would be any question that he's the top offensive line prospect in this draft class because he's so advanced technically. But those are legitimate questions and does show up on tape at times, and it's purely a comfort level of like, some offensive line coaches will watch it and say, no, it's fine. We'll absolutely work with that. He'll be great. And some offensive line coaches will watch that and say, a little too risky, not for us with a potential top 10 pick. And that's what makes Campbell really difficult to project. He could go as early as 4 to the New England Patriots, or he could fall out of the top 10 and the Bears could pass on him as well. He's really got a wide range here, and that's what makes him such an interesting prospect to evaluate in this draft class. Comparatively, Armand Membou from Missouri is a little bit more straightforward, but it does again become a question of like, well, what do you prefer? He's a different style of offensive line prospect compared to Will Campbell, and some teams are going to prefer one way and some are the other. So we'll go a little bit more deep on Armand Membou and look at then how either would apply for the Chicago Bears next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I have the Gametime app on my phone, and I've used it to go to Bears games. I've used it to go to basketball games. I've gone to see comedians, concerts, theater shows, you name it all. Your live entertainment is taken care of in the Gametime app. And there's nothing better than feeling the energy of the crowd around you and witnessing unforgettable moments in person. And Gametime makes it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. With Gametime picks, they sort through all the different ticket listings to just find you the best values for the best seats at your venue. And you can turn on their all-in pricing, so there's no surprise fees at checkout that make your tickets even more expensive. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we've heard a lot about Will Campbell through this pre-draft process, and his arm length has been scrutinized quite a bit. And as a result, I don't think we've heard nearly as much about Armand Membou, right? Membou has less sort of controversy around that, if you will, that less of the, Campbell opens up everything to debate. So do you debate the arm length, right? Like, he's easy to talk about and he's easy for debate television to debate. Membou's a little bit more straightforward, right? His arms are not like extremely long, but they're a good half inch plus longer than Will Campbell's. Membou's arms were measured at 33 and a half at the combine, but the combine measurement's wrong, and then he didn't really do anything at his pro day, so we don't have like good updated numbers on him, and 33 and a half may end up being shorter than what they actually are. But regardless, he is more clearing of that threshold to have long enough arms to stay at tackle in the league. Of course, I think he's a player you could also consider moving inside to guard if he doesn't work at tackle. He played a tiny, filled in at guard very briefly during his time at Missouri for just like a play or two when they had an injury. But nonetheless, like, this is I don't even want to say bigger player because he's not even as tall as Will Campbell, but he's got more size overall. Like, when you look at their measurements sort of side by side, right? Campbell has more height, but Membou's up more in like the 325 pound range. These are both really dynamic athletes. Like, if you look at like the charts of how they performed at the combine, Membou's not as tall, but he's in the 91st percentile for weight and the 70th percentile for wingspan. Of course, they both ran really fast in the 40-yard dash, but Membou was in the 97th percentile for offensive linemen in the 40-yard dash. This is the typical, like, more dynamic, bigger athlete offensive tackle compared to Campbell, but then by comparison, not nearly as refined from a technique standpoint as somebody like Will Campbell. So, like, he's somebody who I think moves really well and has quick feet for that size, over 325 pounds. Like, he's someone who gets out of his stance and is low out of his stance. He ran a lot of different types of pass sets at Missouri, vertical sets, 45-degree sets, quick sets, jump sets. Like, they had him doing a variety of things, notably, should say, from the right tackle position, where he played pretty much all of his college career, where Campbell played left tackle at LSU. But he's just someone who's very good in that short area movement, but then can also really get out in front as a run blocker, whether it's those sort of stretch, pull and pin and pull plays out to the front side or pulling from the backside. Like, he moves really, really well and is fluid in that movement for a player of that size. I think there's room for the hand technique to get better. There's room for the placement to get better. There's room for even tightening up the footwork a little bit more when it comes to pass protection there. But more so for Membou, I think, is you don't see him quite, really like maul and be that strong, like, enforcing. When you think of like the stereotypical old school right tackle, like he doesn't always have elite power. And even at 325 pounds, he doesn't always get deep enough to anchor super strong. You're not, even a smaller pass rusher can push him back a little bit. You're not running into the brick wall necessarily, despite him being a 325 pound some odd, right tackle there. Like, you want to see him be able to generate a little bit more power and have a little bit more of that sort of, strength, if you will. It's not that he's weak, right? But it's more like absorbing strength as opposed to like power as opposed to strength and being able to anchor there. Like, he's a little bit more of a finesse style of player for someone as big as he is. And maybe you want a little bit more nasty out of Armand Membou there. Now, you could, if you put him in the right locker room, on the right offensive line, can you get more out of them? Can an NFL, nutrition and weight program give more strength and power to him without necessarily putting on a bunch of pounds and stuff? I mean, we have heard Ben Johnson say he wants to see Braxton Jones add some more weight to be a little bit stronger. Presumably they might think the same sort of thing for a player like Armand Membou if he were to be in the mix here. But I think I get the feeling that Membou is a player who the ceiling is higher than perhaps Will Campbell in terms of like you can make Membou even better than he is right now, but the floor is a lot higher on Campbell than where it is on Membou. Like the floor is a little bit lower. There's more of a bust potential. Not that I think Membou is a risky prospect, but like Campbell feels safer. Membou feels like he has a wider variety of outcomes, some of which could be like, man, if you add a little bit more strength to this guy, like he can move and get out in space, better than someone like Will Campbell. But that's going to require a little more cleaning up and a little bit more, work in the weight room and like some things like that maybe are a little less of a quote unquote sure thing. If you can consider any player in the draft a sure thing, Will Campbell's technique makes him as close to a sure thing somewhere on your offensive line. Membou is less of a quote unquote sure thing. But let's not act like his technique was like bad and causing some problems or something at Missouri. Like this player, famously, Armand Membou did not allow a sack this past season. He also did not allow a quarterback hit this past season. None of his pass rushers and none of his pass blocks against pass rushers led to the player touching his quarterback. It's a pretty impressive to do that for a full season as the starting right tackle in an offense that certainly passed the ball plenty. It's really well done. You look at like the pass protection numbers, pressure percentages allowed. Armand Membou gave up pressure on just under 2% of his pass blocking snaps, whereas, for comparison, Will Campbell was at like 3 and change. So it's not a huge difference, but Membou gave up lower rate of pressure as a pass blocker than Will Campbell. Should say that, Kelvin Banks from Texas and Josh Connerly from Oregon gave up less pressure than both of them. If, pressure percentage is not the pure measurement and evaluation of exactly who the best or better offensive lineman is, but like Membou was really, really solid. He gets out in space in the running game really well. He held up in pass protection really, really well. And you think, wow, man, if I could take him into the NFL and refine some things, he could be even better. And so I think we're starting to get a sense here of like some of the key differences between Campbell and Membou. Like clearly no one's going to sit here and say, oh, one is great and the other is bad, right? It's about splitting hairs a little bit and nitpicking and saying, well, if you had to decide between the two of them, you could easily be happy with either and happy with both, right? If you have the chance to draft either one, wow, look at us, we got a very good offensive lineman with either player. But if you had to pick one or the other, and specifically to fit with the Chicago Bears in terms of what they're going to run on offense and what they could use on their roster, sort of what they need or what the fit would be with this Bears offensive line, how do you start to separate the two of them and the right fit here? Some of it's always going to be personal preference, but we'll look at some of the things that apply them specifically to this Chicago Bears situation next on Locked On Bears. So if Armand Membou and Will Campbell are both on the board when the Chicago Bears draft with the 10th overall pick, which direction is Ryan Poles going to go? Now, if you're an everydayer who makes Locked On Bears your first listen every day, you already know that my preference is Membou over Campbell. There's a slight lean there, and I did my best not to let that bias the discussion of both of those players through the first two segments here, but I'm sure some of that seeped through, and I don't want that to come off as like anti-Will Campbell. It's just personal preference on which player I think is the player I would rather put on this Chicago Bears roster. Whether that means Ryan Poles feels the same way is a very different conversation. We heard Ben Johnson talk about how like, hey, listen, like they're going to evaluate those guys regardless of what the measurement numbers are and just let that happen. But I think there's a couple of things I point to here in the debate between the two guys that make me think Poles might lean Membou over Campbell also. The caveat here is that with Ben Johnson and Dan Rochar as offensive line coach, like they may have some real sway in here to go a different direction. But I can't help but think back just 2 years ago, 2023. Different coaching staff, different offensive line coach, different team, different roster construction at the time. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. But when the Chicago Bears were also on the clock with the 10th overall pick, after trading down from 9 to 10, but the Bears are on the clock with the 10th overall pick, and there are two offensive tackles prospects sitting there that the Bears, among others, that the Bears could choose from. They could take the super technically refined, day one, ready to roll, cookie cutter, perfect offensive line prospect with short arms named Peter Skoronski from Northwestern, or they could take the bigger, athletic right tackle who could use a little bit more technique cleaning up, but has a lot more of the physical tools that you might want. And you can, maybe the ceiling is higher, but the floor is lower, in Darnell Wright from Tennessee. And in that situation, Ryan Poles opted for the right tackle with a little bit more of the physical traits that maybe needed a little bit more of the technical work, and passed on the left tackle who was super sharp from a technique standpoint, but had those arm length and maybe some physical concerns there. Notably, Peter Skoronski has since moved inside to guard for the Tennessee Titans. It's pretty much played, I think he was a guard pretty much from the start for them. And so this very recent track record of Ryan Poles taking the player, and we should be very clear, Will Campbell and Peter Skoronski are not the same player at all. And Darnell Wright and Armand Membou are not the same player at all. But the player he passed on the player that's closer to Will Campbell in favor of the player that's closer to Armand Membou, as opposed to the other way around. And I suppose you could say, well, then if he took the Darnell Wright before, well, now he doesn't need another Darnell Wright, so wouldn't he want to take the Armand Membou or wouldn't he want to take the Will Campbell, then the Peter Skoronski version now, because he's already got the Darnell Wright? And I'm not so convinced that that's the right logic there. I think Skoronski's arm length concerns seem to have been enough to concern the Bears about, well, we don't want to take a guard here, so let's make sure we get an offensive tackle. And I've also heard people say, well, Membou's played right tackle and Darnell Wright played right tackle, so how is that going to work? Isn't there just as big of a question mark of sliding him over to left side? And it's not to say that sliding a player like Membou over to left tackle, or you could move Darnell Wright over to left tackle, not to say that that's just super easy and is an automatic plug and play, but I don't think it's as difficult as maybe we've traditionally thought it has been. I think there has long been a feeling in NFL history that, you know, your right tackle is your run blocker and your left tackle is your pass blocker, because you want to protect the quarterback's blind side in pass protection more than the front side, and teams put their best pass rusher on that blind side of trying to get after the quarterback, and that generally, you know, teams also tend to run the ball to the right a little bit more than they run to the left. And I think some of that convention still holds up, but not all of it. So I looked to double check. Ben Johnson's Detroit Lions definitely ran right-handed. Jahmyr Gibbs and the running backs in Detroit ran to the right more than they ran to the left. Perhaps that's because Penei Sewell was your right tackle, and so you want to run behind your best offensive lineman. And if Penei Sewell had been playing left tackle, could they have run to the left more? Perhaps. But the point being, like, the Bears may want to have their better run blocking tackle on the right side. Now, whether that's Wright or Membou is probably a different conversation there. But the whole idea of, like, well, you need to have your better pass protector on the left side isn't so much the case anymore. It used to be that the best pass rushers were going up against left tackles, and so that was the premier matchup. But that is no longer the case in the NFL. Teams line up their best pass rushers on both sides, both edges. They kick them to the inside, and there's not a significant difference in the sort of pass blocking matchups. The quality of pass rushers facing your left and right tackle are no longer very different in the NFL. Teams move them around enough and have good enough players on both sides, and some top flight pass rushers actually do rush against right tackles. I mean, Khalil Mack did a lot of that in Chicago. He was more of a right tackle pass rusher than a left tackle pass rusher a lot of the time. And when they had Robert Quinn and Khalil Mack, they'd put them on both sides, right? There was a lot of different options there. And generally speaking, defenses are smart enough to say that whether it's your left tackle or your right tackle, they want to get the best matchup for their pass rusher. So it doesn't matter which side of yours is the weakest. They're going to attack that with their pass rusher. So the point being, you could move Membou to left tackle just fine. You could move Darnell Wright to left tackle just fine. It's a transition. It will take time for them to settle into that spot. but you're not asking them to do something drastically or crazily different there. And I think the preference would be who you like more as your lead run blocker on that right side. And I kind of like the idea of Membou as a left tackle anyway, for somebody who can get out in space and make effective blocks on the backside of zone running plays. Seems to me like a good scheme fit there. Because that's the other thing. When you look at the run scheme that these two offensive linemen played in college, Missouri's running game is a lot closer to what Ben Johnson did in Detroit in terms of a lot more of those outside zone runs that ask these linemen to get out in space, as opposed to Will Campbell at LSU was doing a lot more like short area inside zone runs and gap scheme, closer to what the Bears were running this past season with Shane Waldron and then Thomas Brown and eventually what Tyke Tolbert, or the wide receivers coach, took over. Nonetheless, like from a run scheme fit, Membou is a better fit there. And I still have enough concerns about Will Campbell's arm length that I don't want to draft a guard with the 10th overall pick. And Membou is more of a solid offensive tackle at either left or right tackle. And the last thing here is like, we talked about it briefly earlier, right? Will Campbell's like, you try him at tackle, and if he doesn't work, you can put him inside at guard. And that's like, oh, well, so then you're fine either way. If it doesn't work at tackle, you've got yourself a guard. That's fine. I think the same thing can be true for Armand Membou. Like, it's not to say that he's automatically going to be a great guard if he's not a good tackle, but like we assume it's like, well, if Membou doesn't work at tackle, you get nothing. It's like, no, you could still try him at guard and maybe still get him a pretty good guard. Like he has that ability to work well in short areas in addition to really getting out in space. And I think the assumption, like we give Will Campbell points for saying, oh, well, he can be a great guard if he fails at tackle, and we can give Membou similar points. Maybe because Campbell's technique is more refined, he's more of a easier plug and play at guard. But I also think the transition of Campbell's stance and having to change quite a bit his pad level inside a guard doesn't make that as automatic as people assume it is. Just like it's not automatic that Membou couldn't be successful at guard either. So, well, I think this is neck and neck, and I will never like fault somebody who has Campbell over Membou. I think personal preference and the slightly better scheme preference for the Chicago Bears would be a player like Membou over a player like Campbell. But it doesn't mean Campbell would be a bad pick or a wasted pick, or that Membou is a perfect pick either. It's just about, hey, get a good offensive lineman, upgrade your offensive line, and figure out later how they're all going to fit together. Because you never know. Like, you could draft Campbell at left tackle and play him for a year there, and then say Joe Thuney leaves after 1 year or something, or Jonah Jackson gets cut after 1 year, and then maybe Kranan Magaji's ready to start in year 2, and you could move Campbell into guard then. We're thinking about different possibilities here. Kranan Magaji can also move inside to guard. He played guard at Yale. That's another thing we should keep on our radar and talk a little bit. I mean, we're not going to do a whole podcast about it, but that's another thing that people forget. It's like we keep talking about Amagaji and Braxton Jones competing at tackle. If the Bears draft a left tackle, or if Braxton Jones really has a great season and gets an extension, like Amagaji has played guard before. You drafted him to play tackle, and you hope he can play tackle. Just like we talk about Campbell can move inside a tackle, Amagaji started 10 games at right guard at Yale. And he could potentially play guard in the NFL if for some reason tackle doesn't work for him. Just like the same thing is true for Membou and Calvin Banks from Texas as well in this conversation. So there's a lot more options here. And I think the Bears are in a good spot where I think they should have a shot at least one of these two guys on the offensive line. You would hope one of the two can be there at 10, plus some other options for them to pick through. So we'll see what Ryan Poles decides. But we'll have plenty of time to keep breaking down NFL draft prospects for the Bears all offseason long, all April long until draft day, right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and that includes all of your favorite teams. We've got Locked On NBA shows, Locked On NHL, Locked On MLB. All your favorite sports teams are covered by Locked On podcasts every single day. So for a second listen, go check out one of our other Locked On Podcast Network shows for one of your favorite teams. Come on back for another episode of Locked On Bears tomorrow, and you'll get another opportunity to bear down.